Good morning, everyone. We are going to be getting started here in a minute, but there are still some people who are trying to join the call, so I'm going to give us some time for them to get started. But we will be taking a look at the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship research statement today, and I'm excited to share more about it with you all. The session is going to be recorded. We will just be sharing it with people who've registered for it, but we're not able to attend. But do feel free to keep your video off and keep yourself muted if you do not want to be featured in that. But we will get started very shortly here, and look forward to your questions and sharing more about this particular opportunity. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started because I've got a fair bit of material that I want us to cover this morning, but others are welcome to join us. For those of you who haven't had a chance to join any of our earlier sessions, my name is Matt Kluffenstein, and I am a Graduate Fellowships Advisor for the National Fellowships Office. I'm joined by my colleague Chastity Graham, who advises primarily undergraduate students on STEM competitions, and we are both contact points for the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program. We've done a number of sessions over the course of the summer, looking at review criteria and the personal statement last week. This is our last application-specific workshop for the summer, but we are available to work with you individually going forward to the deadlines in October, and are always happy to take a look at drafts or provide feedback or talk through any aspect of the application along the way here. But thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we will get started with the presentation. All right. So let me provide a quick outline of what we're going to be covering in our time together this morning. We'll take a moment to overview or to look over the specific prompt for this particular part of the application there to make sure we understand exactly what NSF is asking for when you're writing this research statement there. We'll also take a look at some key pieces of general advice to keep in mind, how to approach this statement, some things to focus on, some things to avoid, some potential pitfalls to be aware of there. We'll hear from some current students and also take the time to think through conceptually what it is that you're trying to accomplish with this particular statement there, and then do a little bit of work looking at some excerpts from a successful previous sample there and really trying to break down how it does a good job of focusing on the features that we're going to be looking at here. And then I'll leave you with an optional exercise that you're welcome to do on your own time to kind of analyze and look at another example to try to think about what makes a research statement compelling for this purposes here. Feel free to drop questions in the chat at any points. I'll do my best to keep up with that. We'll certainly make sure that there's time held at the end to further discuss anything that comes up here. And the goals for today's session, first and foremost, understand the purpose of the research statement. So in order to write an effective statement, you really need to understand what it is that it's trying to accomplish there. And then with that knowledge, be able to begin outlining your own research statements if you've not already done some work related to that. And as you're doing that, be able to recognize the key features of a successful statement so that you can look for ways to incorporate those key features into the draft that you're working on. So those are our goals here. I'm just going to take a minute here to remind everyone that these are the parameters of the program. I think everybody here has come to a previous workshop, or I recognize your name, so I'm not going to take time to talk through this other than just to mention that the new solicitation has been released for this competition cycle. Please read over that carefully. You should have access, if you've attended a previous session, to our Microsoft Teams group where these files are being saved there. If this is the first time you're joining us, I'll be adding you to that group and you'll be able to access it later on. You can find this on the GRFP website as well. That's the official document that contains all of the details, the official eligibility criteria, the due dates, which will fall during the week of October 16th through 20th. Your specific dates will depend on the field that you're applying, you're putting your application in. It will be a day during that particular week there. And again, you can find all this information in the solicitation document and on the Graduate Research Fellowship Program websites. The one substantive change to the program this year is that they've increased the tuition allowance. That's not something that really matters to you as an applicant, but that's something that will hopefully be a boost to institutions who are receiving fellows here for this. Happy to answer any questions about this program, any questions about eligibility individually or at the end of our session here today. As a reminder as well, for applying to this particular opportunity, there are a few things that you need to do. This is just a quick overview of the documentation that you will need to provide here. The GRFP application portal is now open. You can go in now and you can begin inputting your information. It's an online portal where you can type in CV, resume type information, personal information. You can save your progress as you work along it. Do not hit submit until you are absolutely final with everything that you're doing there, but you can save and work on your materials along the way. And then the two written statements are really the bulk of the information that you're going to be preparing. The personal relevant background future goals statement that we took a closer look at last week, and then today's focus, the graduate research statements. Beyond that, transcripts and letters of recommendation are required as well. The letters of recommendation deadline is a little bit later than the other deadline for everything here. This year, it is going to be October 27th at 5 p.m. And you can find that information in the online portal. So shifting to the research statement here, this is the official language that NSF provides if you look into the portal and start working on your application there. And they say, present an original research topic you would like to pursue in graduate school with a 2-page limit there. And they ask you to unpack it in a couple ways. They say, describe the research idea, your general approach, as well as any unique resources that may be needed for accomplishing the research goal. You may choose to include important literature citations, address the potential of the research to advance knowledge and understanding within science, as well as the potential for broader impacts on society. Those are those two NSF research criteria, intellectual merit and broader impacts, that we also took a look at earlier in the summer. I won't get into them right here, but please take a look at those earlier recordings and slides that you can find on Teams to get a better understanding of exactly what NSF means by that particular language here. And then just a reminder that the research that you're describing there needs to relate to one of the fields that are eligible, and a very detailed list of all the fields and subfields can be found in the current solicitation. So this is the language that the NSF gives you, and these are the parameters that you have for it. I'll just flag that there are specific formatting requirements here. So when you go to upload your documents, do make sure that you are using the appropriate font size, that you're using the appropriate paper size. Things that do not conform to this may very well be rejected, and I would hate for anyone to have their application not considered for something like this. And I'll just add that you do need to have labeled sections for broader impacts and intellectual merits. Both of these things need to be included in both of the sections that you are, both of the documents that you're writing for this there. And the NSF also has a little disclaimer about not using Google Docs to prepare your statements because they've had problems with formatting that into PDF as well. All of this information is in the solicitation and on NSF's website. So it's a quick overview of what the prompt is asking you to take a look at here. Let's focus on some general pieces of advice to go about achieving that goal of describing the research project that you are intending to pursue as a graduate student and some of the details that go along with that. And I want to return again to the point that I've made consistently throughout our workshops here, which is that the Graduate Research Fellowship is an investment in you as an individual and you as your potential. What that means in the context of this research statement here is that this is not a grant where you're going to get money that will help you pay for this particular research project here. NSF is interested in the research you're doing, but they're interested in the research you're doing as a way of showing how it reflects your potential as an investigator going forward. So while the research and its merits is significant and they want to see that you're going to be contributing to projects that have the potential to advance knowledge there, the reason that this fellowship is asking that is that they want to see your ability to be a productive and impactful researcher going forward. So think about this statement as your opportunity to show that you have the ability to think like a researcher within your particular field. Your ability to formulate and to execute original research here, not just to carry out research that other people have done, but to contribute meaningfully to projects there, as an independent investigator would. And the way that you reveal this is by proposing a significant feasible research project that you could conceive of doing as a graduate student. NSF is not going to require you to carry it out exactly as you've written it there. You're not going to have to document in a few years' time, if you receive this fellowship, how you executed all the aims you listed along the way there. Most students are going to propose a project that they will end up working on, but things can change. And again, the purpose is not that you are getting funding to carry out this project as you're describing it there. It's to demonstrate your ability to think like a researcher. To that end, because it's focused on you and because it's about your ability to contribute to research, you really need to make clear what you're going to be doing as part of this. And I flag this for anyone here who is in primarily a lab science field where you're largely working with other people, perhaps there. Very common to write collaboratively about what the lab is doing or what we are doing. That's fine as a disciplinary convention in most cases, in manuscripts and things like that. For an individual fellowship like the GRFP, you really need to be indicating what your specific role is there. So be careful with that we language or the lab kind of general language, because reviewers need to see that you have the ability to contribute to research, that you don't have just some vague role, or maybe you're just kind of in the background while other people are doing the more substantive work of research there. So be sure to indicate exactly what you're doing. If you're going to be taking measurements, if you're going to be doing data analysis in a particular program, if you're going to be the one out in the field collecting particular samples or whatever the case might be there, or calibrating an instrument, that's something that should be flagged in there so that reviewers understand your abilities and your contribution to that. Here's some other pieces of advice to keep in mind when thinking about writing about your research for a statement like this. One, you need to have some level of technical detail that will reveal that you really understand what your field is. The GRFP is a very broad program, so I know that many of you might be in different fields, and what a proposal in psychology looks like versus one in sociology versus one in marine biology is going to look different. Those are different fields, those are different even kind of disciplines in some ways, and that's okay. But you do need to make sure that what you're writing is something that is substantive to people in that particular field there, that you understand your topic, that you have the right training to be able to best approach the type of research that you're proposing to do there. So having that kind of detail is going to be important. Dr. Tammy Richardson, who is a member of our NSF committee, put it this way at a workshop last year. She said, write this statement like a scientist, not like a poet. So this is going to be a little bit different than the personal statement here. The tone is going to be a little bit different. This is more like a manuscript, even if you are going to be using some of that I language in most cases here. Also, this is an opportunity to demonstrate that you understand what your field is doing right now. And so citing relevant literature is oftentimes important, and I would say is generally expected for these particular statements here. Because of the limited space you have, you can't be exhaustive. You can't put 50 different citations, but a few well-chosen citations that demonstrate that you know what's going on in your field, that you understand what the literature is about, is going to really help enhance the quality of your proposal there, to show that you understand what the key questions are, and that your work is in conversation with what other scholars are doing, and that it's been influenced by models, ideas, hypotheses, and so forth that have been employed by other scholars there. And as is the case with the personal statements, this is also an opportunity to think about what are the key pieces of information you really want to make sure that a reviewer is not going to miss. And this is where using some strategic underlining or bold text can be really effective here. You don't want to go overboard with this, too much of it, and it becomes difficult to look at and hard to know where to focus your eye. But using bold or underlined text strategically, in the case of the research statement for some disciplines, including a well-designed figure or chart of some kind, can really be an effective way of conveying important insights from your information and of drawing the reviewer's eyes to key statements. And so things like a specific aim, things like an overall objective or hypothesis statement. Those are great kind of things to put in bold or underlined text because those are key features of the research that you would really want reviewers to be able to understand. So those are some things to keep in mind to include as part of a research statement here. There are also some things that you would probably do well to avoid. And so I want to briefly note some common pitfalls that can take place when you're writing on a research statement for something like this as well. One of them is the issue of scope. You need to propose a project that's something that you could carry out in graduate school, but at the same time, it shouldn't be so ambitious that reviewers will question whether or not you would actually be able to implement that. If it's something that would take so much time or require just enormous amounts of resources, they might have questions, even if it's a really transformative project, about whether you would ever be able to carry it out. At the same time, you don't want the research to be so narrow or so conservative that it's difficult to see what its contribution would be, or that it might seem like something that you could just do over the course of a summer, as opposed to being a larger project that might be the basis of a dissertation, for example. So trying to find that right balance of a project that is appropriate to the amount of time you would have in the graduate degree that you're going to be going into, and that is something that you could actually complete given the resources that would be available, the equipment, the mentorship, et cetera, at the institutions that you're enrolled in or intending to enroll in is going to be important. Another common pitfall is that projects sometimes in early drafts are mostly just descriptive, that you're really just focusing on the details of what it is that you're doing without really taking that first step, which is establishing why you're doing it there, why anyone should care about those particular details that you're working on in terms of executing the research that you're proposing. So establishing significance is really important. Avoiding projects that are purely descriptive, where you just kind of dive into the nitty-gritty details of the research that you're proposing without stopping to make sure that reviewers have a reason to care about any of that research that you're doing there. Another common pitfall has to do with vague language, especially around methodology or the work that you're doing, or even around questions too. So saying that you want to explore a topic or investigate a topic, it's not that you can never use those words here, but that really raises a question. How will you explore it? How will you investigate it? So try to use precise language that's going to actually indicate what it is that you're doing. I'm going to measure this. I'm going to analyze using this particular technique here. So thinking about the kind of verbs that provide specificity about the actual actions you're going to take, as opposed to things that are broad and that naturally just prompt a follow-up question, which is, how will you do that? How will you investigate this? Achieving appropriate focus is another challenge there. And so sometimes the lack of focus is something that's easy to fall into, especially in early stages of developing a research project. And this can often manifest itself in having just too much going on, so many different aims, so many different hypotheses. The research that you're proposing needs to fit together as a coherent project. If it seems like you're trying to do like 3 different experiments that don't really connect together in any meaningful way, reviewers will have questions. They won't really understand why it is that you're talking about all of these sort of things here. So you don't want aims that are so completely different that it seems like they're not even part of the same project. At the same time, another pitfall that can happen is that if your aims are completely dependent on each other, then the research falls apart if anything goes wrong. So if your second aim basically is completely dependent on everything with your first aim going exactly according to plan, otherwise you can't even do anything with it, that's a problem as well. So you want things that are related to each other, but not so dependent that the research really just has one point of failure and nothing can come out of it. But at the same time, it shouldn't be so many different things going on that it doesn't feel like a more cohesive project there. And that's really gets to the larger issue of feasibility, which is really what a lot of these things are touching on here, is that can you actually do this research that you're proposing there? And are you proposing to do it in the appropriate way? So having the appropriate methodology is going to be the case as well. Again, you could have a brilliant hypothesis and great objectives, but if the means that you are suggesting to investigate that is not appropriate for your discipline, or if reviewers are not convinced that that's the right way to answer that question, that's still a problem as well. So those are some things to keep in mind in terms of trying to establish effective research statements here, as well as some things to be wary of and make sure that you're avoiding so that you can have strong, focused, feasible research descriptions as part of your statement here. And all of this is because the larger goal of what the research statement is trying to accomplish is, again, creating a significant, original, feasible research project. So significance in this context means something that makes an intellectual contribution to your field, that intellectual merit criteria, and it has implications for broader impacts, that other criteria that NSF wants, that it's going to advance knowledge in your field, and it's also going to contribute to those societally beneficial outcomes that NSF talks about. Original means that you're doing something new, and that's what you're doing is going to generate new knowledge. So I like to make a distinction between data and knowledge. Data is the information, the raw material you're gathering there. Knowledge is that data in service of answering a question, something that's going to further understanding, that's going to make a theoretical contribution as well to your particular field there. And then feasible, which we talked about before. Do you have the skills, or that you'll gain the skills as part of your graduate training? Do you have the resources, or you'll be able to access the resources to carry out your proposed work? That could mean facilities, that could mean mentorship, lab space, all those sort of things all can factor into that. If you can touch on all those points there, then you have a good shot of writing a really strong research statement that will hopefully impress reviewers and make them want to fund you. So that's the big picture goal that all of these things are connecting to. I'm going to stop here for a moment and let other people with expertise share a little bit as well. I believe we have graduate fellowship peer mentor, Rebecca Revilla, as well as our faculty committee member, Dr. Kristen Booth, on the call as well. And I would like to turn it over to both of you to share a little bit of your perspectives on what makes an effective research statement, or any advice that you have about how prospective applicants should be approaching this. So either Rebecca or Dr. Booth, either one, feel free to jump in and share your thoughts on this.
I can go first. I thought Matt's tips were really helpful. That's actually a lot of what I was considering when I was writing my research statement. And so I just kind of pulled out like 2 extra points that I think might be helpful for y'all. So when I was doing my research statement, in addition to kind of pulling out the intellectual merit and broader impact, I also made sure to have like headings for my background, and then my my different like aims and hypotheses, and then my method, my expected result, like all of those sections, I made sure they were very clear so that the reader could go back and look and find the sections that they wanted to. So yeah, making sure each of the sections are very clear. And then another point that I thought was really important that Matt made was making sure your statement is feasible and realistic for you as a person. So like what's feasible for me might not be feasible for like another grad student, because we have different skills, different backgrounds, different experiences. So if you set up in your personal statement that you're doing like, that you've experienced like one type of research, you can't just jump to something else without showing that you have any other like skills that you're trying to develop in that area. So I think it's a really good way to set up your research statement if you talk about the skills that are required to do your research in your personal statements. That's what I did. So that my reader, like when they read my research statement, even though it might have been like maybe a more demanding research project, they saw in my personal statement, I have experience doing that, or I was more recently learning those skills. And then also, I submitted my application when I was a postbac student, but I had used my time before I submitted the application to get some preliminary results. And I included that in like one sentence as like more evidence that I could potentially do this project, even though you don't have to do it for the NSF. I really do think they care a lot about like the feasibility, even though you don't have to do it. So, and then also depending on your year or level, like if you're an undergrad or a grad student, like first year, second year, your research statement is going to look different because you don't know what lab you're going to be in grad school if you're an undergrad or a postbac student. But as a grad student, you are likely already working in a lab. And if you're a second year student, you might have even started working on the project that you're proposing. So you might have that preliminary results. Yeah, so there's the two main kind of things that popped out to me.
Those are really, really good points. From a faculty perspective, I want to throw in maybe some more of the technical side of things in terms of requirements that I think would be really helpful to you guys. So I started writing a list based off of what Matt was saying. So the first thing I would say is get an idea of what's going on in your research field. A really great way to do that in terms of what NSF is interested in, I just put it into the chat. It's called NSF's 10 Big Ideas. Go to that webpage, see what they're interested in, because they also like to fund research topics that fit into their narrative of their mission goals of what they're interested in doing. So if you don't know what you're going to do, start there, and then tailor that to your specific field. So I'm in power electronics, so I like to look into renewables, and then it kind of bleeds from there in terms of getting into the specifics of what you're interested in. Once you have an idea, go into the university's library website, and you have access to all the databases of pretty much any field that's available at the university here. So if you're in electrical engineering, for example, we use IEEE Explore. Every professional organization that's associated with a degree, it has a similar database. So take a look into that. If you don't know what database to use, you can just use the library search engine and say, I'm interested in renewable energy. Tell me what's available. Once you kind of get an idea of what's going on in your field, what I would say is write fast, write often, edit later. You only get, is this the 2-page? Yes, this is the 2-page side. So you're going to probably potentially write 3 or 4 pages, or, maybe just a little over 2 pages, and then condense it down into something that fits the 2-page requirement. I'm a big fan of, I write horribly the first time. My students don't believe me. I've had to prove it to them. So I will just write everything I'm thinking, not good sentences. If you've ever used the Pomodoro technique, where you write for 20 minutes, take a break for 5 minutes, don't think, just do. I'm all about it, but it's a rough way to go at it. But I'm a better editor than I am writer. So if I just try to think about writing, I get a roadblock. And in terms of writing, I would suggest, and this is also going back to, you looked into the library database, you've seen what's available in your field, look at how people write in your field, because the way that you write should replicate what you see in the field, at least to some extent. You're going to be more of a novice at it. You're younger. You don't have necessarily the same amount of time and resources. But to get an idea of, at least for my field, we don't like to talk in first person for research. Any of our papers online generally avoid it. So just look at your field and make sure that you write in that something that resembles how people in your field write. Let's see here. You might be an undergraduate. You might not know where you want to go to graduate school, but talk to someone that you enjoyed their class. Ideally, they might have an idea for a topic for you to write about. I did that with one of my students who was successful last year. We have plenty of ideas. We don't have the time to write for all of them, hopefully, or not hopefully, we just don't have the time. So we'd be happy to throw you guys an idea and get you kind of going in the right direction. So talk to your faculty that you currently work with or have had a class with, as well as if you know what school you want to go to, contact that professor that you want to work with and say, hey, I'm really interested in writing for NSF. What would you like me to write about? And they probably have an idea. So reach out to your network of people that work in the field so that way you can kind of see what's going on and they can help you get good ideas. Yes, if you have hopefully you guys have done some sort of research with someone at the university. If you haven't, it's not too late. Get connected with a faculty member today. But if you can request and I put this in emphasis points, strong letter of recommendation, strong. If you say strong, they tend to be a bit more particular about how they write it for you. Because you have to have 2 or 3, make sure that you ask each individual letter writer to focus on a different part of you. And one of them should focus on your ability to do research. Even if you've never done research before, maybe you did a really nice class project that you laid out a really great report for, whatever it is, get that faculty member to write about how you have a potential to do research, even if you've not done any before. I would suggest one strong figure on the very first page. It's just something reviewers have to look at potentially 10 of these. If you have a nice image, people will remember it. It's a lot easier than seeing a lot of black and white text. And then I would definitely recommend spending some time. This goes back to that feasibility that they both mentioned before. Make sure that you leave space in your report, or sorry, in your research statement for a timeline. I would say like a quarter of a page at least, where you say, year 1, I'm going to accomplish this task. And then year 2, I'm going to accomplish this task. Whatever it is, go through that kind of timeline in some format. Matt's correct that you have to be careful that things don't completely hinge on each other. So what can be a good way to work around that is to say, if it works, I do this, this, this. If the first step didn't work, I'm going to pivot and do this thing that's closely related. So that way you show them that you not only know what you want to do, but you also have workarounds if it doesn't work the way you expect it to. One last thing that I see for a lot of STEM fields to be wary of is to avoid a lot of use of AI. I know that that's kind of a big topic right now. But the reason why I say avoid it, or at least be careful if you're going to use it, is because it's like using a hammer and everything's a nail. And we want to make sure that you use it with a particular need or requirement of why you're using it. And that whatever other methods are available in the literature do not work for what you're trying to do. Or if you want to talk about doing something with AI, talk about how you want to improve AI. So not just using a method that's out there, but maybe taking it one step further and saying, here's a method of AI. I'm going to do this one tweak and then use it on this problem. So that way you're not only just using a tool that we have available to us, but you're also understanding how that tool works and how it can be applied to your particular problem. And that would be a much more successful route than just saying, I'm going to use AI on this large piece of data, because it's just not as exciting as what it used to be in terms of what people have already done with the field. I think that has gotten all of my stuff on the list.
Great, thank you so much. There was a ton of great advice there. I think it looks like there's a question in the chat already, but if others have questions for either Dr. Booth or Rebecca, please share them at this time. Question about how to condense.
Okay, yeah, condensing can be really, really difficult. That question does make sense. So this is where I mentioned it last week when I was in the personal statement setup. Every word really does matter. So if you have any sort of transitional phrase, what's a really good one that takes really a long, there, not even therefore, but something that's a prepositional phrase. Because of this, I can do this. Be very, very particular about the words that you use, because you can say a lot in 2 pages. You can likely say everything you need to do that you already have in 3.5 pages, but it will take you going through saying, is this word important? Is this reference important? Can I make my figure smaller and more impactful? And make sure that you put your figures can be, that you don't want them centered with a lot of white space around them. Get them over to the side, get text over next to it so that you can use as much of your landscape. You only have 2 pages, like you said, use it to your advantage. But yeah, it comes down to picking out every single word. Is this important? Am I making a good story? What do I really need to do to transition from thought to thought? And potentially, if you have done research before and you're basing it off of research you've previously accomplished, get that published, put it in archive on the university's website, do something so that way you can just reference it as opposed to having to explain it in a lot of detail.
Other questions for our expert guests? I will just emphasize what Dr. Booth is saying about understanding your particular field here, because some of this is going to mean more depending on what you are. If you're in a social science field, maybe you're not typically using figures. So, it's not that you have to have all these features, because again, what one discipline is doing or expects is going to be different from another one there. And it's not that you have to make sure that every application looks exactly the same across all these disciplines. You just need to make sure that the people who are going to be reading it, who will be in that particular field, expect to see the research presented in that particular way. So if some of this seems like, wait, I've never done this, or I've never read a paper that looks like that, that's fine. Be talking with faculty who are in that field, and they can give you advice on how to structure those sort of things. I will go ahead and jump back to our presentation here, but thank you so much, Dr. Booth and Rebecca. Others, please feel free to reach out to them with questions, and I'm sure they would be happy to continue to share from their experience with this particular opportunity. All right, jumping back here. Let's talk a little bit about some other ways that you can potentially organize some things here. And so I have on this slide 2 possibilities suggested by some websites that have provided some guidance on the NSF GRFP that you might approach in the STEM field. And then on the next page, I have one that might be more typical for a social science field. These are just suggestions. There's a lot of variation out there. If you look at the Google spreadsheet on Alex Lang's site of all the different proposals that people have crowdsourced for the GRFP, you can get a sense of what it might look like in your particular field here. But both of these approaches are really going to be covering the same sort of things, and it all relates to the larger points that I made earlier, where you want an introduction, where you're going to demonstrate what your topic is and why it's significant, and what your larger objective is. You're going to need to have a research plan where you will have hypotheses, objectives, where you're discussing methodology, data sets, whatever that might mean in your particular discipline, and that you also need to have those specific sections on intellectual merit and on broader impacts. If you go to Alex Lang's site, he has a breakdown of some additional questions you can ask yourself for each of those sections. For the sake of space, I didn't try to put it all on this slide here. Mallory Ladd is another good resource for this as well. She offers a slightly different way of breaking it down, but it's covering the same sort of things as well, where you have your research objectives, you have clearly labeled hypotheses. If you have previous research, as Rebecca was sharing before, preliminary results, it's a great thing to be able to flag. If there's field work that you're going to be doing, as part of that, some discussion of where that's going to be, what that's going to look like is going to be part of that. And the terminology can vary as well. There's different language that gets used to describe these sort of things, whether it's called the experimental approach, whether it's talking about literature review or significance section. just understanding what it is that you're trying to do with each of those sections are different ways you can do that. So whatever feels most appropriate to your project or your discipline, these are just some ideas to get you started. But again, intellectual merit, broader impacts, these are a must. Those are requirements for formatting the NSF asks for. If you don't put it in there, there's the possibility that your application could be rejected without review, which is, of course, an outcome that we are all trying to avoid. If you are in a social science field, I just threw this together here because I think those tend to be a little more different. There's a lot of variation within these fields here, but in general, I think an introduction where you outline both your topic and your larger objective there. Here you might have a section that's something about the background or the context of your research, because if you're in economics or if you're in sociology, you may need to provide a little bit of information about the social reality that you're looking at, or the business context or something there, as well as discussing literature, showing how your particular interest in, say, migration patterns or something is relevant to larger questions that are being raised in your discipline there. And then a larger section that would really be about the methodology that you're looking at. How are you going to be collecting and analyzing data? Are you using existing data sets? Is it going to be based on field research, interviews, whatever that might be? And then, of course, the required sections, intellectual merit and broader impacts. So I laid these out here not to suggest that it has to be one of these options here, but just to remind us all that there are a range of different ways you can organize these things there, but that fundamentally they're going to be covering the same type of topics, and they're really going to be the information that reviewers need to know to answer those kind of questions, to establish those goals that the statement is trying to achieve that we looked at earlier here. And with that in mind, I just want to offer what I'm calling a conceptual outline of what I think a good proposal is going to look like. So this is not necessarily the way you would label sections for a particular proposal here, but this is how you kind of organize things in terms of the ideas you need to establish before you talk about some other piece of information here. And so I've broken it down for what it might look like in a social science discipline or what it might look like in a STEM discipline. In either case, you want to start with some larger issue, some important problem that's going to be significant to your field, and it's going to have some significance in terms of broader impacts beyond that. So some bigger issue that a reviewer is going to immediately recognize is important, that you're going to establish hopefully within that introduction there. And that larger problem is then going to provide the framing for your more specific project. And so you're going to want to move into your research question or your research objective by explaining how, in order to address some aspect of this big, larger, important problem, we need to understand this other thing. In order to understand that, we need to investigate this. And that's where you're going to start coming in and introducing your research there. And so you want to have a clear objective about what it is that you're trying to understand that relates to this other big problem before you start introducing specific hypotheses and specific aims and things of that nature. In a social science discipline, you really need to show that, of course, that there's a larger problem there, but then also that you provide some background, some context, and a sense of what scholars in that field are currently talking about. What's a pressing question? What's something that's not well understood or contentious that you're going to be contributing to in some way there? And in that case, sometimes the research question will come after you've established a little bit about what the debates are, what are some of the key issues there, and then use that to say, well, here's this unresolved issue, and my objective is to address it in some way there. And then that's going to lead into a more detailed discussion of methodology, which is a really important component there, where reviewers are really going to want to know, are you answering this question in the appropriate way? Have you thought about the research design clearly? And so in both of these cases here, again, this is not necessarily a writing outline, although it could proceed in this order here. This is just thinking about what are the ideas you need to establish? What does a reader need to understand first in order to appreciate the next thing that you're doing? In order to appreciate what your hypothesis is, a reader needs to understand what the larger objective is and why we should care about that particular objective here. So I think it's really important to start with that big picture significance to make sure that you can have that buy-in from reviewers, because if you start with too much of a detailed description of the research you're proposing to do, reviewers might be wondering why you're even doing this at all, what the larger payoff is going to be. But if you start with a clearly articulated larger problem, with a clear research question that then leads naturally into hypotheses, which then leads naturally into a discussion of the aims about how you're going to evaluate that hypothesis, then you're providing the reviewer the information that they need at each step of the way. They'll be able to follow along easily, and hopefully they'll be able to appreciate what it is that you're trying to do. So that's my general advice in terms of how to organize the ideas that you're going to be presenting within a research proposal, so that people have what they need in order to appreciate each part of the proposal as you're going through it here. So let's take a minute and unpack this a little bit in the context of a sample statement here. So this is an excerpt I've, for the sake of space, pulled out some portions here, but it's from the first few paragraphs of the research statements from Grace Ditzler, who was a 2020 recipient applying as a second-year grad student in the field of microbiology. You can read this full proposal and the reviewer comments on Alex Lang's site as well. But I'll give you just a minute to read over this, and then we'll break it down a little bit and think about how this does those sort of things that I was just mentioning here. So let's think through this a little bit. You don't need to know anything about the specifics of this research about bees or microbiomes or anything here. The point, I hope, that you'll take away is that a well-organized statement still gives you a sense of what someone is trying to do and why it might matter, even if you don't really know the field that well here. And so the fact that hopefully you can recognize some of those key features that we looked at here, even if this might be very far from the research that you're planning to do, speaks to the importance of having that kind of clear organization and thinking about establishing a proper structure to the ideas that you're going to be presenting. So before we break it down there, let's just go back to thinking about some of those things that you want to be touching on as we looked at with the conceptual outline a moment ago here. So with this larger statement, you should be demonstrating that there's a clear logic that moves from that broader specific or significant issue, that's sort of the larger topic that you're situating your research in, to the specifics of your proposed work, that you're making a funnel that starts broad and then narrows it down to the more granular details of your particular projects here. So within the context of this proposal, we'll take a look at parts of this excerpt here where the applicant identifies an important problem, something that's of both scientific and broader significance, where there's a larger research objective that's introduced, some gap in knowledge that the applicant is arguing is important to fill in order to understand that larger problem that's being posed there. Specific hypotheses, the things that you're trying to aim or demonstrate, what you want to prove or evaluate there. And then how you're going to carry out that hypothesis, those are the specific aims, the actual steps that the research is going to entail here. And we'll take a look at each of these in turn. So jumping back to our example about honeybee research, started by stating an important problem, which I think this application does very quickly with those first 3 sentences. Talks about how honeybees contribute significantly to the economy, but populations have been declining significantly. And the year before this application was submitted had been significantly bad hive loss in that winter there. This threatens the US economy and food supply. And this is something that impacts both the scientific community and agricultural stakeholders to investigate reasons for honeybee deaths. So we have a problem here that's both scientifically significant and also has some important broader impacts there. This is a major economic, ecological issue that goes beyond it there. So in the first couple of sentences, we have a sense of why somebody should care about this if you don't know a lot about the role of cornerstone pollinators, or if you're not really that invested otherwise in the population dynamics of honeybees here. Now we have some reasons why both scientists and the larger world beyond that would be interested in what's going on with reasons for honeybee deaths. So within this larger problem of trying to understand honeybee deaths, we have a more focused objective that emerges here in this text that I've highlighted in green here. And so this research is going to focus on one aspect, one potential factor in trying to understand reasons for honeybee deaths. In this case, this has to do with trying to understand what role the gut microbiome of honeybees plays in their health outcomes, which the applicant is arguing is something that's not well understood, but may have a role in all of this. So the extent to which, in the last sentence of this first paragraph, the extent to which the honeybee gut microbiome influences health outcomes remains unclear. For these reasons, the scientific community is diligently working toward the characterization of honeybee microbiota. A little bit later in the next paragraph, also the contributions of the gut microbiota to host immune pathways and mechanisms by which the host responds to gut variation has yet to be investigated. So this is two things that are going on here with this research objective, more narrow objective. One is establishing that this is something that people are interested in, that scientists think that the gut microbiome has something to do with the overall health outcomes, and therefore, by extension, honeybee deaths and life. And there's an aspect of this that is not well understood. This is something that is yet to be investigated. So we have a narrower dimension of this larger big picture question, which is that too many honeybees are dying, to thinking about one factor that might be related to that, to thinking about one aspect of that factor that is not something that is well understood. So the objective is going to be to understand the mechanisms and immune pathways by which the honeybee gut microbiome is functioning. This is, of course, my non-expert paraphrasing of all of this, but again, I think this is something that you can follow along as a reader who might be unfamiliar with and still get that sense of, okay, this is where this research is going. It's getting a little bit more specific here. How is this larger objective going to be investigated and carried out? Well, we have some specific hypotheses that are following after we've already established this need, this gap in the literature that's important to understand in order to address the big picture question that's that the research starts with here. And so the applicant says, I aim to identify possible routes of honeybee microbiota co-diversification with two hypotheses. And you can see these particular hypotheses, one about the genotype, diet, environmental landscape in the microbial community, and that this can impact, the community can impact the immune system of bees, and that this can be affected by the addition of probiotics. And then, and we won't look into this part here, although I'll pull an example in a moment, this immediately segues into some specific aims. I plan to test these hypotheses with the following aims. So things are laid out very nicely here, where you start with, and I've highlighted all of this text here, you start with a couple sentences that's establishing that big picture significance and a problem and showing how this is something that's of interest in terms of broader impacts and in terms of intellectual merit. You narrow it down to a specific dimension of that larger issue that your research is going to focus on and make a claim for why there's a need for that particular type of research there. And that in turn leads to some particular hypotheses that are going to be investigated, which helps set up following aims that will be the actual research steps that will be taken in order to assess those hypotheses and address that larger question here. So these are the things that's, that your research statement really needs to be establishing and thinking about. And Actually, I'll say one thing else about specific games here before we kind of take a big picture look at all this as well. So that's sort of the introduction is what we looked at in the previous slide, and thought about the different things that were going on in those first couple paragraphs and establishing the larger context for talking about the research. When you get into specific aims, if you are in a discipline where this is something that is typical of research statements there, the purpose of what you're doing here is trying to connect specific research tasks to those larger goals that your research is trying to accomplish. So you never want to lose sight of that big picture here. And one of the key things to be doing, and part of that is always making sure that you're connecting what you're doing with why you are doing that. And this is something you can do at the level of a paragraph or even the level of an individual sentence. So this is making sure that reviewers always understand not just the specific things you're doing in terms of your research, measuring this data, running these simulations, collecting these samples, but why you're doing that at each of those steps, so that it's clear how those steps are going to contribute to those larger goals, to evaluating the particular hypotheses there, and that the methods you're proposing there are appropriate to the work that's, or to the questions that you're asking. And so here's an example from that same research statement. I've highlighted the text here to show some examples of where this is going on here. This is one of the specific aims for this larger project about honeybee microbiomes. So the aim itself is a comparative analysis of functional and spatial diversity in a particular species gut microbiome following immune system challenge. In blue, I've highlighted text that talks about specific reasons for why things are being done. So the larger aim is to do that. Why is this being done? To determine if altering the microbial community with probiotics can modulate the immune response of bees and reduce fatalities due to this particular parasite. So that's kind of the why for the larger aim itself. And then in the rest of this paragraph, you can see specific tasks, specific research things that will be done, highlighted in red. And oftentimes in the same sentence, part of that sentence, which I've highlighted in blue here, will show why that particular task is being done there. So shotgun metagenomics will be performed. Why? To compare strain level functional diversity between experimental groups and determine the impact of probiotic strains on composition functional diversity. That might not mean anything to you. This is not my field either, but the point is you can see that there is a description of specific research task, a form of analysis that's going to be done, and there's an explanation for why it's being done. What is going to be the outcome of doing that? What data is going to be generated? How is it going to lead to something that will help assess whether or not this aim is going to be successful here? Functional pathways will be identified in each group and quantitatively compared. Why? To ascertain all these things in the rest of that sentence. mRNA sequence will be completed to quantify and compare host response to these pathways identified by metagenomics. So always having that close connection between what you're doing and why you're doing that, so that reviewers understand the methodology that you're proposing, so that they can say, yes, that's exactly the technique that should be used if we want to understand these particular things there. And I've highlighted a sentence in purple as well that provides a little bit of additional justification for the methodology here, where there's a reference to pilot data that has been collected as well, and that it addresses a potential concern that a reviewer might have as well. Confirms that our methods are sensitive enough to detect distinct spatial microbial compositions consistent with the literature. So the applicant is thinking that reviewers might wonder if these methods might have enough sensitivity to actually get the data that they're looking for here. And so they provide some additional reassurance for that and say, we have pilot data that confirms this, and also this data is consistent with larger literature here. So we can have confidence that these methods are appropriate for what we're trying to do here. So this is how you can think at the level of aims about constructing things there as well, where you have a larger paragraph that explains what you're doing and it also explains why you're doing it. And then the specific steps that go into carrying out that larger aim are always being connected to that why question, so that reviewers always have that understanding about how that you understand why you're doing the things that you're doing, why you're choosing the methods, the experimental techniques, the samples, et cetera, that you're going to be employing as part of this. Again, this might look different in your discipline in terms of how this is organized, but this general principle of connecting what and why I think is something that transcends specific fields, even if you're going to be writing your research statements in a different way, and maybe you don't have the same type of hypothesis aim structure that some other disciplines are going to employ. And you can see from the comments on this review proposal that these are features that stood out to reviewers who rated this proposal highly and ultimately selected the applicant for the award here. So well-focused, access to a lab to continue the study. You can read the rest of the research statement and see some other things that were not covered in what I just shared here. A clearly outlined section for how aims will be accomplished. So the clarity of the organization was something that was appreciated by reviewers as well. And I just want to note as well that even though this was a successful proposal there, that they did note that there were some things that could be improved as well. One reviewer noted that there was a lack of discussion of potential results or alternatives if an aim fails. So that's something that we mentioned before in terms of making sure that you're considering other possibilities if something doesn't go exactly according to plan. Something that reviewers are paying attention to, even in proposals that are otherwise excellent as well. You can see that a lot of the things that I've tried to draw our attention to here are things that stood out to reviewers in assembling or in providing feedback on their particular proposal here. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've got some great advice from others. I'm going to stop sharing here and I'll stop the recording as well and turn things over to all of you for questions